Today we're going to be talking about natural selection. Natural selection was an idea developed by Charles Darwin back in the mid-1800s. Natural selection occurs because variation exists in all populations of organisms. Because of variation, some organisms are better adapted to their environments than others. And those who are better adapted tend to be healthier and better nourished, and therefore produce more offspring than less adapted individuals. Over time, the population begins to look more like the better adapted individuals. Now, natural selection consists of 4 parts. The first part is genetic variation. All populations consist of individuals that vary slightly from each other in terms of their genetics. And this genetic variation leads to variation in traits. And these traits could be coloration, they could be speed, they could be size of claws, they could be beak size in birds. The next part of natural selection is going to be overproduction of offspring. So organisms are going to produce more offspring than the environment can actually support. And this is going to lead to a struggle for existence, which is going to be number 3. A struggle for existence. Organisms struggle. They compete with each other in terms of food, in terms of avoidance with predators. Okay? And number 4 is going to be differential survival and reproduction. Because organisms have a variation of traits, some organisms are going to be better suited for their environment. They're going to be better adapted to their environment than others. And therefore, they're going to be healthier and better nourished. They're going to avoid predators better. And because of this, they're going to be more likely to make it to reproductive age. And they're going to have more kids than less adapted individuals. And over time, the population is going to begin to look more like them. Next, let's talk about the bell curve. And let's talk about this information in terms of the bell curve. So we're going to draw a graph here. That'll be our x-axis, our y-axis up here. This will be number of individuals or organisms. And the x-axis is going to be phenotypes. Phenotypes means the outward appearance of an organism. And we're going to have a range of phenotypes because of all that genetic variation we have within a population. Let's take, for example, height. Let's use that as our phenotype. And here at school, if we took 100 individuals, 100 males, for example, and we measured their height, we would expect to get a range of heights. And let's assume that all these individuals are the same age also. But we would have a range of heights. We would have individuals that are very short. We would have individuals that are very tall. And most of our individuals would probably be right in the middle. They would be of average height. So, there's height. Now, if we went ahead and we actually plotted this information, we get something that looks like this. We get a few individuals who are very short. Some individuals would be taller. We'd have individuals that are even taller. A number of individuals that are still taller yet. Some even taller. Most of our individuals would be average in height. And then after we got to most of our individuals being average in height, we get some individuals who are a little taller still. A few less that are even taller. A few less that are even taller. And a couple who are just plain extremely tall. Now notice that most of our individuals are going to be of average height. And as we get further and further from the average, meaning as we get more and more extreme, fewer and fewer individuals are going to be in those categories. So this right here is going to represent the majority of our individuals. The majority of our individuals are going to have average phenotypes. They're going to be average height in this case. And just a few individuals are going to fit into the extreme categories, meaning very tall or very short. But we have a range of phenotypes because we have a range of genetic variation within that population. If we actually draw a trend line, we get something that looks like this. We get a bell curve. We get a bell curve. And you can see the trend line right here. This is our bell curve, represents the average, represents the two extremes. Now keep that in mind because we're going to compare the other types of natural selection. We're going to compare the trend lines for the other types of natural selection to our bell curve or our normal distribution curve. Let's go ahead and start with the first type of natural selection called directional selection. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to erase this information. We'll redraw our axes. And we'll redraw our bell curve. There it is. Now the first type of natural selection is going to be directional selection. So I'll go ahead, I'll write that right here. Directional selection. And directional selection occurs when one of the two extreme phenotypes is selected for. For example, let's talk about a tropical island. Tropical island gets plenty of rain, gets plenty of warm temperatures, so we would expect it to have lots of plants that produce seeds. And let's suppose that the seeds serve as a food source for a population of birds. All right? Now, let's suppose that the majority of our seeds are going to be medium size. And some of the seeds are going to be small, and some of the seeds are going to be large, but the majority are going to be medium. So what size beak would we expect for our population of fictitious birds here? We would expect the majority of the birds to have medium-sized beaks. If the bird's beak was too small, they would have difficulty cracking open the seed and extracting the nut from inside. If the bird's beak is too large, the bird's going to be a little bit clumsy. It's going to be awkward with the seed. It's not going to be able to, it's going to fumble around with it. It's going to have difficulty opening it up and manipulating it. So, in this case, the bird that does best is going to have the medium-sized beak. But what would happen if the weather changed all of a sudden? And our nice tropical island suddenly went through a drought. Not a lot of rain. And now, most of our bushes, most of our plants, are now going to start producing small seeds instead of the medium-sized seeds and even fewer of the large seeds. What type of bird population is going to do best? Those individuals that have smaller beaks are going to do better. They're going to be able to not only open the seed, but they're going to be skilled at it. They're not going to be awkward at it. So smaller beak size is going to be selected for here. When that occurs, our trend line is actually going to shift to the left here. Okay? Now let's assume that this represents small beaks. This would be the average size beak, and then we would have very big beaks. Initially, the average size beak, the medium beak, was selected for. However, because of drought conditions, we got lots of small seeds, and what happens here is birds with smaller beaks are going to do better. And our curve is going to actually shift like that. And this is called directional selection. Now, just the opposite could have happened. What if we would have had more rain than normal? Maybe we would have had even bigger seeds than average produced. And then who would have benefited then? The birds with larger sized beaks. And in that case, this curve would have shifted to the right. And instead of the curve being here, it would have been over here. That also would have been directional selection. So again, directional selection is when one of the two extremes, is selected for. Let's talk about the next type of selection called stabilizing selection. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to erase the directional selection curve. And I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to erase directional selection. I'm going to put stabilizing. Stabilizing selection. Now, stabilizing selection occurs when the average individual is selected for. The more average you are, the better you do. So let's take for an example human babies. Okay, birth of human babies is stabilizing selection. Because if a baby is too small, if a baby is underweight, let's assume that the average size baby is around 8 pounds. If the lower the baby's weight is, the greater the chance that it is either undernourished or has some type of developmental problem, and it's just not going to thrive like a normal baby should. And because of that, it's going to have a higher incidence of death, unfortunately. Now, just the opposite are if we take larger babies, 10-pound baby, 11-pound baby, the further you get from the average, the bigger the baby is. And you might say, wasn't that a good thing? Baby's really healthy, really well nourished. However, mom's got to give birth to that baby. And if baby is too big, mom has difficulty giving birth to that baby. And again, the more difficult the birth process is, the greater the risk of that baby dying in the process. So the baby that's going to be selected for in this instance is going to be the average weight baby. It's well nourished, it's healthy, however it's not too big to pass through the birth canal in mom's bony pelvis. In this case, the trend line is going to look like this. In this case, this is stabilizing selection. The majority of our individuals are going to be exactly average. And the further you get from average, the greater the chance of that individual, of that organism, not making it. The last type of natural selection we're going to talk about is disruptive selection. So let me go ahead and erase this curve. And let's talk about disruptive selection. Now, disruptive selection occurs when both extreme phenotypes are selected for at the same time. Again, both of the extreme phenotypes are selected for at the same time. Let's go back to our tropical island again. And again, let's suppose that over a period of time we have mainly medium-sized seeds. And these medium-sized seeds select birds with medium-sized beaks. However, our weather conditions change, our climate changes, our long-term climate begins to change. And for whatever reason, medium-sized seeds are selected against. And we have lots of small seeds and lots of large seeds. So what type of bird population would we expect to do the best? Well, it turns out both our extreme phenotypes would actually begin to do the best. Those birds with small beaks would do very well. Those birds with larger beaks would do very well. However, the population of birds with medium-sized beaks would begin to suffer. They would begin to be selected against. And we would have a trend line that looks like this. We'd have one peak here, It would dip in the middle where the average is, and another peak at the other extreme. Now let's take this even further. Let's assume that our climatic conditions persist year after year, maybe decades, hundreds of years, even thousands of years. What's going to begin to happen is this. We're going to select more and more for the small beaks and the large beaks. Year after year, we're going to get this. Less and less medium-sized beaks. Until finally, we have two separate populations. Birds with mainly small beaks and birds with mainly large beaks. What just happened here is called speciation, the creation of a brand new species, a separate species. So over time, what could actually happen here is our two populations of birds eventually might not be able to reproduce with each other. They might not be able to breed with each other. At that point, we have two new species. And that's it for natural selection.